Every farmer in Mercer County remembered the day Eleanor Carter dragged her grandfather's rusted rake across the dead field at the edge of Route 9. They gathered at the fence line like crows on a telephone wire, elbows propped on weathered posts, hats tilted back to get a better view of the spectacle. A woman, 34 years old, widowed, with hands that had never known the proper weight of a hoe, trying to breathe life into 40 acres of soil that hadn't produced a decent crop since the drought of 1989. The dirt was grey, not the rich, chocolate brown of healthy earth, but the colour of old ash, compacted so hard by decades of neglect that it rang like ceramic tile when she struck it. The men laughed. Not the cruel, sharp laughter of bullies, but the soft, pitying chuckles of men who had buried their own fathers in this soil and knew exactly what it took to make a field surrender its bounty. They watched her wrestle with the rake, her thin shoulders hunched against the October wind, and they shook their heads. Old man Henshaw, who had farmed the adjacent property for 52 years, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and said what everyone was thinking. That woman just signed the death warrant on whatever savings she's got left. That field's cursed. Always was. Always will be. The others nodded. They had watched 3 different families try to revive that parcel over the past 2 decades. Each one had planted, prayed, and ultimately walked away with nothing but debt and broken equipment. The soil had gone saline. The drainage tiles had collapsed sometime in the 70s. The groundwater had receded to a depth that made irrigation a fantasy. It was a graveyard of agricultural ambition, and Eleanor Carter, a former kindergarten teacher who had inherited the property from a distant uncle she barely remembered, was about to become its latest victim. What those men didn't know, what they couldn't have known from their comfortable perch at the fence, was that Eleanor had already lost everything that mattered. The laughter that drifted across the fallow acreage didn't reach her ears, because she had built walls around herself so high that no sound could penetrate. 16 months earlier, her husband David had been killed in a grain elevator accident over in Caldwell County, leaving her with a mortgage she couldn't pay, a daughter named Sophie who needed surgery for a degenerative hip condition, and a bank account that had been bleeding dry since the funeral. The first tragedy had been the accident itself, sudden, violent, and irreversible. The second tragedy had been the insurance company's refusal to pay, citing a technicality in David's policy that their lawyers were still fighting in court. The third tragedy, the one that sat heaviest in her chest when she woke at 3 a.m, was the letter from County Medical that had arrived the previous Tuesday. Sophie's surgery was scheduled for December, but without the $5,000 deductible, they would cancel the appointment and bump her to the bottom of a waiting list that stretched 18 months long. Eleanor had spent that night sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, staring at the dead field that came with the property, and she had made a decision that seemed insane even to her. She would plant. Not next spring. Not after she had saved enough for proper equipment. Now. With a rake she found in the barn, seeds she bought with the last $40 in her wallet, and a stubbornness that her late mother had once called her most dangerous quality. The first failure came within a week. She had read online that cover crops could regenerate dead soil. So she bought clover seed from the feed store in town, broadcasting it by hand across the grey expanse. The clerk had looked at her strangely when she asked for seed in October, but he took her money and loaded the bags into her trunk. She spent 3 days scattering the seed, her fingers numb from the cold, her back screaming in protest. Then the rains came. Not gentle or autumn showers, but a 3-day deluge that turned the field into a shallow lake. The clover seed, which had no root structure to hold it, washed into the drainage ditches and disappeared. When the water finally receded, the field looked exactly as it had before, grey, lifeless and mocking. She stood at the edge of it, her boots sinking into the mud, and she cried for the first time since David's funeral. The second failure came 2 weeks later. She had noticed a depression in the northwest corner of the property, a low spot where water seemed to gather and linger longer than anywhere else. She borrowed a post-hole digger from the church basement and spent an entire Saturday trying to sink a makeshift well. She dug 8 feet down before she hit a layer of limestone so hard that it bent the blade of the digger. No water, not even dampness, just rock and more rock, and the growing certainty that the old farmers at the fence line had been right. She sat on the lip of that failed well until the sun went down, her hands blistered and bleeding, and she thought about driving to the bank the next morning and signing the foreclosure papers. The third failure was the cruelest. She had managed to save $200 from selling David's tools. A betrayal that felt like selling pieces of his soul. But Sophie needed the surgery. She used the money to rent a tiller for the weekend, determined to break up the hardpan that she was certain was suffocating whatever life remained in the soil. The machine arrived on a Friday afternoon, a hulking, rust-eaten beast that smelled of gasoline and defeat. She wrestled it across 2 acres before the tines struck something metallic buried 18 inches down. The impact sheared a gear inside the tiller, and the rental company charged her the full repair cost, $340 she didn't have. She returned the machine on Monday morning, walking the 3 miles into town because she couldn't afford the gas. And when she passed the diner, where the farmers gathered for coffee, she heard them laughing again. This time, she knew they were laughing at her. She almost didn't go back to the field on the morning of November 3rd. The thermometer had dropped to 28 degrees overnight, and frost coated the dead grass along the driveway like a layer of powdered sugar. Sophie's school bus would arrive in 40 minutes, and Eleanor had promised to pack a proper lunch, instead of the peanut butter crackers that had become their staple. But something pulled her toward the field. A compulsion she couldn't name, a stubborn refusal to let the land win. She pulled on her husband's old work gloves, the ones with the torn right thumb, and she picked up the rake. Not the tiller, not the post-hole digger, just the rake. A simple, ancient tool with wooden handle and steel tines that her great-uncle had probably bought from a Sears catalogue in 1962. She chose a section near the centre of the property where the hardpan seemed slightly less severe, and she began to pull. The work was brutal. Each stroke required her to put her full weight behind the tool, and the tines scraped across the compacted soil with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. She raked in rows, methodical and slow, creating furrows no deeper than an inch, barely disturbing the surface. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the Henshaw place, and she could feel the eyes on her again. She didn't look up. She just raked, row after row. Her breath came in white clouds. Her shoulders burned, her blisters, which had barely healed from the well digging, reopened and stained the inside of David's gloves. She raked until her arms shook, until she couldn't feel her fingers, until the sun had climbed high enough to melt the frost and turn the grey soil into something that looked almost silver in the morning light. It was the silver gleam that stopped her. She had been raking for nearly 2 hours, lost in the rhythm of the work, when the tines of the rake struck something that didn't sound like stone. It was a dull, heavy thud, the kind of sound metal makes when it hits metal. She pulled the rake back and looked down. There, in the shallow furrow she had just created, something caught the sunlight and threw it back at her with an intensity that made her squint. She dropped the rake. She knelt in the dirt, her knees sinking into the cold soil, and she brushed away the loose earth with her bare hands. The gleam grew stronger. It wasn't a stone. It wasn't a piece of discarded farm equipment. It was a surface, smooth, hard, and unmistakably metallic, with a dull golden sheen that seemed to pulse in the November sun. She dug with her fingers, clawing at the dirt, ignoring the pain in her hands and the cold that had turned her knuckles white. The object was larger than she had first thought, much larger. It wasn't a coin, it wasn't a trinket, it was a corner of something that had been buried deliberately, long ago, by someone who had taken great care to hide it from the world. Eleanor ran to the barn. She found a shovel, not the sharp spade she had used for the well, but a flat, square shovel meant for moving grain. She brought it back to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she began to dig. The first 6 inches were the hardest, the soil fighting her, clinging to the blade with a stubbornness that felt personal. Then, suddenly, the resistance gave way. The earth around the object had been packed differently than the surrounding hard pan. Looser, darker, as if someone had dug a deep hole and filled it back in with care. She worked in a widening circle, clearing the soil in layers, and slowly, impossibly, the shape emerged. It was a box. Not a modern box. Not something that had fallen off a truck or been discarded by a careless farmer. It was a metal strongbox, roughly the size of a microwave oven, with a hasp that had rusted to the color of dried blood, and a surface covered in intricate scrollwork that had been worn smooth by decades of pressure from the earth above it. She tried to lift it. It wouldn't move. She dug deeper, clearing the soil from beneath it, and she realized that the box was sitting on a bed of something that looked like fabric. Rotted, blackened, but still holding its shape enough to suggest that whoever had buried this treasure had wrapped it in oilcloth or canvas before placing it in the ground. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the shovel. She looked toward the fence line. The farmers were gone, driven inside by the cold. She was alone with whatever secret the dead field had been keeping. She didn't open the box in the field. Something primal, something that understood the weight of what she had found, told her to wait. She covered the hole with loose straw from the barn, marked the spot with a piece of baling twine tied to a fence post, and she walked back to the house with mud-caked boots and a heart that felt like it might burst through her chest. She made Sophie's lunch. She kissed her daughter's forehead as the bus pulled away. She waited until the house was quiet, until the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and then she went back. She dug up the box again, working faster now, driven by a need that bordered on panic. She carried it to the porch, wrapped in an old horse blanket, and she set it on the kitchen table. The hasp crumbled when she touched it, the rust turning to powder beneath her fingers. She lifted the lid, and she stopped breathing. Inside, nestled in a bed of rotted velvet that had once been crimson, were coins. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They gleamed in the afternoon light that streamed through the kitchen window, their surfaces catching the sun and throwing it back in warm, golden arcs that danced across the ceiling. They weren't modern coins. They weren't the quarters and dimes that jingled in her car's cup holder. They were heavy, thick, and impossibly detailed. Liberty Head double eagles, minted in the 1870 seconds, each one containing nearly an ounce of pure gold. Beneath the coins, wrapped in oilskin that had somehow survived a century underground, was a leather journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to the color of weak tea, but the handwriting was still legible. It belonged to Josiah Mercer, the man who had founded the county in 1881. The journal detailed how he had buried his life's savings, 47 gold coins, the proceeds from a successful cattle drive. In this very field, during the Panic of 1893, when banks were failing and he feared losing everything to creditors. He had intended to dig them up when the crisis passed. He never did. A stroke took him 6 months later, and the secret died with him. Buried under 40 acres of soil that slowly turned from fertile to fallow as generations of his descendants failed to maintain the land, Eleanor sat at that table for 3 hours. She didn't touch the coins again. She read the journal twice, her finger tracing the words of a man who had been dead for 130 years. And she felt something shift inside her. Not greed. Not the wild, desperate relief she might have expected. Something quieter. Something harder. She looked out the window at the dead field, and for the first time, she didn't see failure. She saw possibility. The next morning, she drove to the county courthouse and spent $20 on a title search. She confirmed what the journal suggested. The land had been in the Mercer family until 1947, when it was sold to cover taxes. The new owners had farmed it for 30 years before the soil gave out. Then it had passed through a series of speculators, developers, and dreamers, each one walking away poorer than they had arrived, until it had finally been deeded to her great-uncle as part of a tax settlement in 2003. He had never set foot on it. He had died 6 months ago, and the property had come to her because she was the only relative who hadn't refused the inheritance. The farmers had been right about one thing: the field was cursed. But not by nature, by neglect, by a secret that had been buried so deep that the land itself had gone sterile trying to protect it. She didn't sell the coins. Not immediately. She took 3 of them to a dealer in the city, a man with a jeweler's loop and a reputation for discretion, and he confirmed what she already knew. Each coin was worth approximately $2,000 at current gold prices, but their numismatic value, their worth to collectors, pushed some of them as high as $8,000. The total value of the cash, he estimated conservatively, was somewhere between $90,000 and $120,000. She could have taken the money and run. She could have paid off the mortgage, funded Sophie's surgery, and moved to a condo in town where the roof didn't leak and the furnace worked. She thought about it. As she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, calculating the security that amount of money would buy. And then she thought about the journal. Josiah Mercer hadn't buried that gold because he was afraid of being poor. He had buried it because he believed in the land, because he understood that wealth wasn't something you extracted and spent. It was something you planted and grew. She made her decision at dawn, while the frost painted the dead field in shades of silver and blue. She would use the gold to save the farm, not by selling it, by investing it. The transformation began the following spring, but the work started in December. She hired a soil scientist from the state university, a young woman named Dr. Priya Nandani, who specialized in saline remediation. And together they spent 3 weeks taking core samples across the 40 acres. The results were both devastating and encouraging. The top 12 inches of soil were essentially dead, saturated with salts, and compacted to a density that prevented root penetration. But beneath that, at a depth of 18 to 24 inches, they found something unexpected. The soil was darker, looser, rich in organic matter that had been protected from the sun and wind by the hardpan above it. Dr. Nandani explained that the field hadn't always been dead. At some point, probably during the Mercer era, it had been carefully maintained with deep tillage that had created a layer of fertile subsoil. The hardpan had formed later, when subsequent owners had used heavy equipment on wet ground, creating a plowpan that acted like a concrete lid, sealing the good soil beneath and preventing water from draining properly. The solution was radical, expensive, and physically brutal. They needed to break the pan. Not with a tiller. That would just churn the dead topsoil deeper. They needed deep ripping, a process that used a specialized tractor attachment with shanks that could reach 30 inches into the ground and shatter the compacted layer. The cost was $12,000. Eleanor paid it without hesitation, using 4 of the gold coins. The second investment was water. The failed well had taught her that surface water wasn't available. But Dr. Nandani's core samples revealed something the old farmers didn't know. There was an aquifer beneath the property, but it sat at 42 feet, far below the reach of a post-hole digger. Eleanor hired a drilling crew, and they punched a 4-inch well through the limestone layer that had defeated her in October. At 41 feet, they hit water. Not just water, but artesian pressure that sent a column shooting 6 feet into the air when they removed the drill bit. The water tested clean, rich in minerals, and perfectly suited for irrigation. The well cost $8,000. She paid it with 2 more coins. The third investment was the most controversial. She bought compost. Not bags from the garden centre, but 20 truckloads of finished dairy compost from a farm 50 miles north, delivered and spread across the entire 40 acres. The farmers who had laughed at her in the fall were openly hostile now. They watched the trucks rumble down Route 9, and they shook their heads. "She's burying gold in manure," Old Man Henshaw told anyone who would listen. "That girl found a few old coins and thinks she's a land baron. She'll be broke by harvest." Eleanor heard the rumors. She smiled. She kept working. Spring arrived with a violence that felt personal. The rains came in March, turning the newly ripped field into a sea of mud that swallowed her boots and clung to the hem of her coat. She planted cover crops, not clover this time, but a carefully selected mix of tillage radish, winter rye, and hairy vetch, chosen by Dr. Nandani for their ability to break up remaining compaction and add nitrogen to the depleted soil. The seeds germinated slowly, fighting the cold and the salt, but by April, the field was no longer grey. It was green. A tentative, fragile green that made Eleanor cry when she saw it from the kitchen window, but green nonetheless. She walked the rows every morning, her coffee growing cold in her hands, and she talked to the plants. She told them about David. She told them about Sophie. She told them about Josiah Mercer and his gold, and his belief in the ground beneath his feet. She didn't know if plants could hear. She didn't care. The talking helped her remember why she was doing this. In May, she planted her first cash crop. Not corn, not soybeans. The soil wasn't ready for that kind of demand. She chose asparagus, a perennial that would take 3 years to mature, but would grow in the slightly saline conditions that still lingered near the surface. She bought 10,000 crowns, each one a gnarled, alien-looking root system that seemed too strange to produce food. She planted them by hand, working from dawn until the mosquitoes drove her inside. And when she finished, she had blisters on top of blisters, and a back that felt like it had been beaten with a board. But the field was alive. For the first time in 20 years, something was growing on the Mercer property with intention and care. The summer brought drought. Not a gentle dry spell, but a brutal, relentless assault that turned the county into a dust bowl. By August, the farmers who had mocked her cover crops were now watching their own corn wither in the fields, the leaves curling like burned paper, the stalks snapping under their own weight. Old Man Henshaw's well ran dry in July. 3 other farms in the county reported total crop failure by mid-August. The state declared an agricultural emergency, and Eleanor's field, the dead field, the cursed field, the graveyard of farming ambition, stayed green. The deep ripping had done more than break the hard pan. It had created channels in the subsoil that allowed the artesian well water to spread laterally, reaching roots that would have otherwise died of thirst. The compost had built organic matter that acted like a sponge, holding moisture in the root zone long after the topsoil had dried. The asparagus, which should have been stressed by the heat, was thriving, sending up spears thicker than her thumb, their tips purple and tight and perfect. She walked the field in the August heat, the sun beating down on her shoulders, and she watched her neighbours drive past on Route 9, their trucks kicking up dust clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. They didn't stop. They didn't wave. But they looked. They looked, and they remembered. The first harvest came the following spring, a full year after she had found the gold. The asparagus spears emerged in April, pushing through the soil with a speed that seemed almost violent, as if the ground itself was eager to prove what it could do. She cut them by hand, using a special knife she had bought with the last of the coin money, working bent at the waist in the cool morning air. The spears were enormous, 14, 16 inches long, with a sweetness that the chefs at the farm-to-table restaurant in the city raved about. She sold her first batch for $8 a pound, twice the market rate, because her asparagus had become known as the best in the county. By June, she had grossed $17,000 from a crop that shouldn't have been possible on that soil. She paid for Sophie's surgery. She hired 2 workers from the community, a young man named Tyler who had been unemployed since the factory closed, and a woman named Rosa who had fled an abusive marriage and needed a place to rebuild. She bought a used tractor, not the massive, debt-inducing machines that had destroyed the soil in the first place, but a modest 20-year-old John Deere that she could maintain herself. She named it Josiah, but the real transformation wasn't the asparagus. It was the soil itself. Dr. Nandani returned in the fall to take new core samples, and her report read like a medical miracle. The salt levels had dropped by 60%. The organic matter had increased from less than 1% to nearly 4%, a figure that approached the native prairie soils that had existed before European settlement. The earthworm population, which had been essentially zero when Eleanor started, was now averaging 40 worms per cubic foot, a density that indicated a thriving, living ecosystem beneath the surface. The hard pan was gone, shattered into fragments that the roots and the water and the worms were slowly incorporating into the deeper profile. The field that had been dead was now, by every scientific measure, more alive than the supposedly healthy fields surrounding it. Dr. Nandani published a paper about the remediation in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation, using Eleanor's farm as a case study. She called it the Mercer Recovery. The Agricultural Extension Office sent representatives. The State Soil Conservation Board invited Eleanor to speak at their annual conference. She declined. She had work to do. The second year brought expansion. She added 2 acres of heirloom tomatoes, grown in the compost-rich soil with drip irrigation from the artesian well. She planted a 1/4 acre of cutting flowers, zinnias and sunflowers and dahlias, that she sold at the farmer's market in bouquets that people drove 40 miles to buy. She built a small greenhouse from reclaimed windows she found at a demolition site, and she used it to start her own seedlings, saving thousands of dollars in transplant costs. She bought bees, 3 hives that she placed at the edge of the field, near the wildflowers she had allowed to grow along the fence line. The honey they produced was dark and complex, flavoured with the clover and vetch she had planted as cover crops, and it sold out within hours every Saturday. She kept 1 coin from Josiah's cash, the most worn one, with a date she couldn't quite read, and she mounted it in a frame above the kitchen door, not as a reminder of wealth, but as a reminder of patience, of the man who had buried his treasure because he believed in tomorrow, of the woman who had found it because she refused to stop raking. By the 3rd year, the farmers who had laughed at her were no longer laughing. Old Man Henshaw came to her door in March, his hat in his hands, his eyes avoiding hers. He asked if she would consider leasing his south pasture. The soil was failing, he admitted, and he couldn't afford the equipment to fix it. He had heard about what she had done. He had seen the asparagus in the drought. He wanted to know if she could work the same magic on his land. She didn't gloat. She didn't remind him of the laughter. She invited him in for coffee, and they talked for 3 hours about deep ripping, about compost, about the importance of listening to the soil instead of fighting it. He left with a notebook full of ideas and a look on his face that she recognized, the same look she had seen in the mirror on the morning she found the gold. The look of someone who had just realized that everything they thought they knew was wrong. By summer, 3 more farmers had come to her, each one with a story of failure and a desperate hope that she could help them find what she had found. She started consulting. Not for money. She charged only what they could afford, often just a meal and a handshake. But because she understood now that the gold wasn't the treasure was the knowledge. The understanding that dead soil wasn't dead forever. That with enough care, enough patience, enough willingness to get on your knees and dig, even the most hopeless ground could be brought back to life. The numbers, when she finally sat down to calculate them, didn't seem real. The farm, which had cost her nothing but inheritance taxes and a year of back-breaking labour, was now generating a net income of $47,000 annually. The land itself, which the county had assessed at $12,000 when she inherited it, was valued at nearly $200,000. She had created 4 full-time jobs in a community that had been hemorrhaging employment for 2 decades. She had supplied 3 local restaurants with produce that they featured on their menus. She had paid for Sophie's surgery, which had been successful, and she had started a college fund that would cover 4 years at a state university. She had done all of this not by selling the gold, but by using it as seed money, literally, to plant something that would grow and multiply and sustain itself long after the last coin had been spent. The Journal of Josiah Mercer sat on her desk, its pages now protected by archival sleeves, and she read it sometimes in the evenings, when the work was done and the house was quiet. He had written, on the last page before the stroke took him, a single sentence that had become her motto: The earth does not yield to force, it yields to faith. She stood at the edge of the field on a November morning, 3 years after she had first dragged that rusted rake across the grey soil. The asparagus was dormant now. The ferns turned golden and brittle. But the cover crops were green and vibrant, their roots working deep into the ground, preparing the soil for another season. She held the rake in her hands, the same rake, the one with the worn handle and the bent tine that had struck metal and changed everything. She didn't need it anymore. She had machinery now. She had help. She had a farm that worked. But she kept the rake anyway, leaning it against the barn where she could see it from the kitchen window. It reminded her of the morning she had almost given up, of the cold that had numbed her fingers and the blisters that had stained her husband's gloves, of the gleam in the dirt that she had almost missed because she was too busy listening to the laughter. She had learned the most important lesson that farming, that life, could teach her. The value of a thing is not determined by what it looks like on the surface. It is determined by what you are willing to dig for. And sometimes, the most incredible treasures are buried in the places that everyone else has given up on. The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost, and she walked back to the house to make Sophie's lunch. The bus would arrive in 20 minutes. There was work to do. Always work. Always something that needed tending. Always another season waiting just beyond the horizon. But she moved differently now. Not with the desperate, frantic energy of someone trying to outrun failure, but with the steady, grounded pace of someone who had learned to trust the ground beneath her feet. She had raked a dead field and found gold. But the real gold, she understood now, was never in the box. It was in the dirt, in the work, in the refusal to walk away when every voice around you is telling you to quit. She had planted faith in a graveyard, and she had harvested a future. And if there was one thing she wanted the world to know, one thing she hoped someone, somewhere, would remember when they stood at the edge of their own dead field, holding their own rusted rake, listening to their own crowd of laughter, it was this: keep raking, keep digging, keep believing that something incredible is waiting, just beneath the surface, for someone stubborn enough to find it. The earth yields to those who refuse to stop. It always has. It always will. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the hardest ground often hides the greatest treasures, then let us know. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the next time life hands you a dead field, pick up the rake. You never know what might gleam back at you from the dirt.